Thanks for joining me this afternoon to finish reading a few chapters of our Magic Treehouse book, number 16, Hour of the Olympics. We're picking up today on chapter 6, which is called Mystery Man. Plato and Jack hurried past the crowd standing at the side of the racetrack. Everyone was shouting and cheering. "I have seats next to the judges," said Plato. He pointed to a tall stand with rows of benches. Plato led Jack through the crowd, up the steps to their seats. "Wow, thanks," said Jack. He had a great view. The Olympic parade had started. Musicians playing pipes were at the front. Behind them marched Olympic athletes, the best in all of Greece. Jack sighed as he watched the parade going around the track. Annie would really love this, he thought to himself. "The athletes in the front are runners," said Plato. "Foot races are the oldest event of the Olympics." Jack pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Oldest event is foot races." "Behind the runners are the boxers," said Plato. "They're wearing special gloves and bronze helmets." Jack wrote, "Boxers wear gloves and helmets." "Behind them are wrestlers," said Plato, and Jack wrote, "Wrestlers." When Jack looked up again, he saw soldiers staring at him from the sidelines. The soldier was dressed like an actor from the outdoor theater. He had on a long cape and a red-crested helmet that covered most of his face. But something was strange. This soldier was short, really short. "Here come the discus and the throwers," said Plato, "and then the men in armor." "What do?" said Jack. They race wearing full armor," said Plato. Jack smiled to himself. He knew Annie would think that was funny. He wrote in his notebook, "Some runners race in armor." Jack finished writing. He looked back at the short soldier. "In a moment, the chariot races will begin," said Plato. "Winning a chariot race is the greatest honor of the Olympic Games." Jack just nodded. He was still studying the short soldier, who seemed to be looking at him. Suddenly, a small hand came from the soldier's cape. The hand gave a little wave. Jack gasped. It was Annie's hand waving. The short soldier was Annie. Chapter 7 is called Go, Go, Go. Jack stared in horror at Annie. She must have borrowed a costume from the theater. He remembered Plato's words, "A girl will get in terrible trouble if she tries to attend the Olympic Games." Jack shook his head at her and pointed his finger as if to say, "Get out of here." But Annie just waved at him again. Jack kept shaking his head at Annie. He even shook his fist. Annie turned back to watch the races. "It's not a joke," Jack shouted. Plato turned and looked at him. "Of course not," said Plato. "We take the games very seriously." Jack felt his face grow hot. He glared at Annie's back. Just then the trumpet sounded. "The chariots are taking their places," said Plato. Jack saw dozens of chariots lined up on the racetrack. Each chariot was pulled by 4 horses. Jack glanced back at Annie. She was looking at him and pointing at the chariots. The trumpet sounded again, and the horses took off. The crowd went wild. They were cheering and screaming and stamping their feet. Clouds of dust rose up as the chariots raced around the track. "Go, go, go," she shouted. A few people began staring at the strange, small soldier with the high-pitched voice. Jack couldn't take it anymore. He had to get Annie away before it was too late. He shoved his notebook into his backpack. "I have to go," he shouted to Plato. The philosopher looked surprised. Jack was afraid to tell him that Annie had broken the rules. "I had a great time, but I have to go home now. Thanks for everything." "Have a safe journey," said Plato. Jack waved and started down the steps. As he climbed down, he saw Annie pull off her helmet. Her pigtails flew up and down as she shouted, "Go, go, go!" Her soldier's cape fell off. Now lots of people were staring at him. Someone shouted for the guards. Annie was too busy cheering to notice anything. Jack moved as quickly as he could, but 2 big guards got to Annie first. Chapter 8 is called Save Annie. The guards tried to pull Annie away from the chariot race. Annie looked surprised, and then she looked angry. "Let go of me," she shouted. Jack rushed down the steps of the viewing stand. The guards were having a hard time pulling Annie through all the people. "Leave her alone," Jack yelled. His voice was lost in the noise of the race. He pushed his way through the crowd. "Leave her alone," he kept shouting. "Leave her alone." Finally, Jack reached Annie and the guards. He tried to grab her, but a guard blocked his way. "Let her go," yelled Jack. "I promise I'll take her home." More guards arrived, and the crowd began to shout, "Arrest her! Arrest her!" The guards kept pulling Annie away. "Jack, the story!" cried Annie. Of course, thought Jack, the poet's story. This is definitely our darkest hour. He reached into his bag and pulled out the poet's scroll. He held the story up to the sky. "Save Annie," he shouted. But Jack's voice was lost again in the roar of the race as the 4-horse chariots barreled through the dust. Jack looked around wildly for someone or something to help them. Then suddenly the crowd fell silent. All heads turned to watch as a huge white horse galloped out of the dust. The crowd murmured with excitement and wonder. The white horse was the most beautiful animal Jack had ever seen. He was pulling an empty chariot, and he was galloping straight towards Jack. Chapter 9 is called Fly Away Home. The white horse stopped at the low wall by the edge of the track. "He's come for us," cried Annie. The guards stared in awe at the horse. Annie broke free and dashed over to Jack. He grabbed her hand and they ran to the horse. The guards shouted and started after them, but they were too late. Jack and Annie had already climbed over the wall and into the waiting chariot. "Go, go, go," Annie cried to the huge white horse. The horse reared and pawed at the air. The crowd stepped back from the wall and the guards froze. Jack looked to where Plato was now standing. Plato smiled and waved at him. Then the white horse leaped forward, pulling the chariot behind him. Jack couldn't even wave back at Plato. All he could do was hold on tight as the horse galloped beside the Olympic racers. Jack bounced up and down. Dust and sand got into his eyes. He squeezed them shut and crouched down in the chariot. He didn't know where they were going, but it didn't matter. The white horse was in charge. Jack heard the thundering noise of racing horses and chariots. He heard the screaming crowd. He felt sand blowing in his face and hard bumping and rattling of the chariot. Suddenly he was thrown backward and he heard a swoosh of wind and then silence. "Wow," cried Annie. Jack opened his eyes. All he saw was blue sky. He pushed his glasses into place and looked around. "Help," he cried. The white horse had grown giant feathery wings and was pulling their chariot into the sky. Jack gripped onto the railing of the chariot and held on for his life. "To the tree house," shouted Annie. Below, the Olympic crowd watched in stunned silence. The winged horse left the games behind and flew over the temple of Zeus, over the statue of Nike, over the sacred olive tree, and the gymnasium. On they went over the poet's house, the Greek theater, and the field of white tents. Finally, the winged horse coasted to the ground near the olive grove. What a remarkable ride. The wheels of the chariot bumped onto the grass, and then slowly, they came to a stop. Jack and Annie stepped out of the chariot. Jack's legs were so wobbly they could hardly walk. Annie rushed to the horse and stroked his neck. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack patted the horse's long white neck. "Thanks," he said. "That was the best ride of my life." The horse snorted and pawed the ground. "Come on, Annie, we have to go before they find us," said Jack. "I don't want to leave him," said Annie. "He's the most beautiful horse in the whole world." Her eyes filled with tears. "We have to," said Jack. The horse put his head down and touched Annie's forehead with his soft nose. Then he gave her a gentle push toward the treehouse. Annie sniffled but started walking. Jack took her hand as they walked through the olive grove to the rope ladder of the treehouse. "You first," said Jack. Annie started up the ladder, and Jack followed. When they were inside, Annie hurried to the window. Jack grabbed the Pennsylvania book. He pointed to a picture of the Frog Creek woods and said, "I wish—" "Look," said Annie. Jack looked out the window. The horse had spread his great feathery wings. He was rising from the field. The white horse flew into the blue Olympian sky and then disappeared behind the clouds. "Bye," called Annie. A tear rolled down her cheek. Jack pointed again at the Pennsylvania book. I wish we could go there, he said. The wind started to blow. The treehouse began to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still, absolutely still. We'll pick up real soon with Chapter 10 called They're All Here. Thanks for joining me.